As I was talking to Frederic earlier, if you guys missed it, I'll turn this off for a second. Behind me is a artificial background, and now you see the real background, which is a bean trellis. And I was on like live TV not that long ago when my dog knocked this over, and I'm desperately hanging on to it with both my hands while trying to sound smart. It does not work. So I'm going to turn off that background right now, put the fake one on, so that doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
So let me share my screen because I have slides, people. Let me see now. Okay, if I'm sharing my screen, it will look like this. Window. This one here. Excellent. Can you guys see that slide?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so I put together a few comments on my challenges in engaging in public health communication these last 2, 3, 4, almost 5 years now. Oh my goodness, almost 5 years. And it's relevant to you because increasingly you are going to be called upon to engage with the public. And if not the public, then non-specialists, perhaps policymakers, to advise them on something in which you are an expert and they are not. And the ground has shifted during the pandemic into making that kind of endeavor a little trickier, a little more trickier than it used to be. It's always been tricky, but now it's almost dangerous in its trickiness. So I'm going to share with you my experiences, some of the underlying theory about why it's happening, and what we expect to happen next. And feel free to think up some weird questions. My thoughts aren't in any particular order. We'll just see how it unfolds. Okay. So I want to begin by talking about a paper in 2007, obviously well before the COVID pandemic. This was just after SARS. And maybe most of you are too young to remember SARS, but SARS was the warm-up before COVID. And this paper, which was published by WHO, identified 3 lessons from SARS. Number 1 was that old technologies like mask wearing work. Hiding from your neighbor works. Keeping away from people works. Number 2 is that animal husbandry is bad for human health. Now that's part of my vegan propaganda. We won't dwell on that too much, but I think it's important to note. Number 3 was the big one. Transparent communication is essential. In particular, infectious diseases do not respect international borders. So that got us thinking about the importance of communication. Now, as far as I'm concerned, as noted, since the start of the pandemic, I've done over 2,000 media engagements. It's over 3,000 now. I stopped counting after 2,000. I keep a list somewhere, but it's just ridiculous. And this includes, TV and radio interviews, print interviews, articles for newspapers, etc. I've consulted on 14 lawsuits and testified in court 4 times, including a murder trial, all related to COVID, which we can talk about later if you want. And I've advised media, drug companies, unions, and a few governments on this issue as well. The part that's relevant for you is I've also been answering hundreds of questions from the general public. With those hundreds of questions come a smattering of abusive comments, which can dissuade you. And I'll say at the start, my own grad students were eager to get involved in public engagement. Then they saw the kind of abuse I was getting, and they quickly backed away and said, nope, I want no part of that, which is a shame, because I am worried that we are not graduating a new generation of health science professionals who have an eagerness and a skill set for public engagement as it becomes even more and more important. And again, a lot of hate mail and threats of violence. This has really diminished in the last few months, but it's still there occasionally. But I've also received a lot of gratitude. And it's important to remember that the gratitude really outweighs the hate. We tend to focus on the negative, but really the positive is far more common. A few love letters, mostly from men. It is what it is. It's been absolutely exhausting, but I think it's been a net positive for me. Now, let's talk about the hate for a bit. This is an odd and curious and troubling study. They show that in a survey of Americans, those who believe that harassing or threatening public health officials is justified went up during the pandemic. It should be 0, but it went up from not 0 to even higher, above 0. That is really troubling. And let's talk a bit about Neil deGrasse Tyson. If you don't know who this is, he's a famous astrophysicist on TV all the time. I think he's great, really explains things well. Has a crotchety side, but who doesn't? And he's always saying that scientists, like you and me, should be accessible to the public. And he makes the argument that most people will never meet an astrophysicist. So if he goes to a pub and people recognize him, he's more than happy to answer questions, because when otherwise will they get a chance? However, I'm quick to point out, he is a physicist. Nobody's identity or ideology is shaped by their understanding of black holes. If you ask Neil deGrasse Tyson a question about gravity or the speed of light, that's great, it's abstract. If you ask you or me a question about vaccines and health, everyone's got an opinion. And that opinion is deeply seated in their values and their identity and who they are and their deeply inculcated belief system. And so that gets people's back up really, really quickly. So it matters what kind of scientist you are, the kind of response you're going to get from the general public. I love this quote. COVID-19 is a case study in the interplay between contagion, information, misinformation, and behavior. That's exactly what we've been seeing. It's not so much about the disease itself. It's the stuff around the disease, the way society has responded to the disease, much like the way your body's immune systems respond to infection. All those symptoms that you feel, that's not the disease. That's not the virus. That's your body responding. And all the nonsense we're experiencing in society, that's not the disease. That's our own response to the disease. Case in point, look at this series of graphs. These are the epi curves for a variety of diseases: plague in Bombay, swine flu in Australia, West Nile virus in Texas, so forth. They're all one curve essentially. But here, COVID is a multi-wave disease. Now, there are other multi-wave diseases also. The takeaway from this, there are many takeaways. One takeaway is that the big difference between COVID in the USA and these other diseases is the way that human behavior has played out. So here, the wave went up, and then we closed things down, we stifled the wave. Then the doors opened, and everybody went outside and played, and the wave went up again, and they panicked, and we put the mask mandates on, and we closed the schools, and the numbers went down. And then we opened the schools, and numbers went up again, and the vaccines came out, numbers went down, and the vaccines stopped working, and the vaccine passports stopped being enforced, and the numbers went up, etc., etc., etc. So all of this is human behavior. I would characterize COVID-19 as a crisis in health, in healthcare, in health systems, and health communications. We all take this for granted now, 4 or 5 years later. At the beginning, this slide, I would open up my presentations to the government officials with this slide because it was a new idea to them. This is not just about the disease, it's about how we treat the disease, it's about our infrastructure for dealing with the blowback of the disease and our inability to talk about the disease. So right now, the crisis in our hospitals, if you're not aware, we have ER waiting times of like 15 to 20 hours. We have doctors and nurses completely overworked, and no sign this is going to change in the immediate future. That's a health systems crisis. Yes, it's been exacerbated by the disease, but had we invested heavily in health systems improvement, the impact would not be nearly as much. So focus solely on the disease blinds us to the other aspects of our response. So what is the role of a health sciences communicator or a public health communicator? Well, your first thought is, it's just to talk about the emergency. Hey, there's a disease rampaging. You should know about it. Hey, there's an asteroid about to hit our planet. You should know about it. Next is maybe to create calmness and stop the panic. Yeah, why not? This one doesn't fill me with a lot of joy because it's kind of like a massaging the population. It's trying to impose a behavior rather than simply explaining things and communicating truth. But that is part of the job, trying to assuage panic. Third is to tell people about what we're doing in response. Hey, there's a reason we're asking you to stay home. Hey, there's a reason we're asking you to wear masks. There's a reason that we're rolling out these vaccines in this way. Next is to tell you what you need to do. This asteroid's about to hit the city. You need to kiss all your loved ones goodbye because we're all going to die. Or, you need to stay inside, keep away from people for a while. You need to wait for your eligibility for the vaccine, then go in an orderly fashion to get it. Next is to maybe tell people when that's going to happen. And lastly is to educate people about the underlying science. Like, this is what a virus is. This is how vaccines work. This is what mRNA is. Now, this last part here has really become crucial because it seems that the number of people who don't understand basic biological science is much greater than we thought, and those who claim to understand it actually don't. This has been shocking and has really concerned many of us in public education. My question, though, is public health communication about changing human behavior? Some would say it is. That we want an outcome. We want people to get vaccinated. We want people to stay away from each other. We want people to wear a mask, etc. That's a dangerous viewpoint, which I'll explain in a second. Or is it about informing people? Do you see the difference there? One has the goal of actually changing an outcome. The other simply has the goal of getting people information and trusting them to behave accordingly. This is my default, simply because there is so much distrust of expertise these days. The second they get a sniff that you're trying to change their behavior, the resistance comes about, the hate comes about, the counter arguments, and the disinformation comes about. Problem is that A, you can't trust people to do the right thing, as we've learned, and B, every time you inform people, there's another group misinforming them. It becomes a bit of a warfare. So it's unclear exactly what the best thing to do here. And I'll draw your attention to cigarette, nicotine, public health campaigns in the past. So originally it was, hey, cigarettes are bad for you. Maybe you shouldn't smoke. Then it was about, hey, if you smoke, you've got a higher chance of this, this, and this. Now, this is what you see on some cigarette packages, an actual diseased lung. They're doing everything they can to say don't smoke, short of making smoking illegal. So that's obviously a desire to change behavior. But they're not pulling that last lever of banning smoking. Because informing people worked to a large extent, but it stopped working for a certain population. And we can talk about why that was. We kind of missed the lower socioeconomic stratum of society. They're the ones most likely to smoke, the ones least likely to understand and appreciate the physical consequences of smoking. And there's a huge body of literature exploring why that might be. But that's where we are. So as I mentioned, we did not anticipate the misinformation and disinformation that came about during COVID. Now it's so common, you take it for granted. But this was not expected, at least not by most of us. And we definitely did not appreciate the anti-authoritarian impulse, meaning the huge pushback against any suggestion of personal responsibility. And this was fed by well-organized political actors who would characterize any public health intervention as a liberal totalitarian overstep. So clearly you get a sense of where the ideology is coming from. So let's talk a bit about the disinformation and where it's coming from. So CSIS and American intelligence have done a lot of work on identifying COVID misinformation and disinformation sources. And it may surprise you, but it may not surprise you to learn that they conclude that disinformation is spread by threat actors to discredit government. Who are these threat actors? They are foreign intelligence actors. This should not be surprising to you. This is common knowledge now, but still a lot of people refuse to accept it. So a lot of these people on Twitter mimicking and mouthing the same anti-vaccine verbiage over and over again are really using the same words fed to them by foreign intelligence agencies. It's actually sad to watch. Here's the RAND Corporation did an analysis of disinformation. Here are the key findings. Number one, Russian media advance anti-US conspiracy theories about the virus. Yeah, let's say it bluntly. A lot of this came from Russia. Now, if any of you are Russian, I'm not disrespecting your heritage or your people at all. I'm saying right now the Russian government has a really strong hand in pushing COVID and vaccine misinformation deliberately. Not just the Russians, the Belarusians, Some of it comes from Iran, other places. It's not my expertise, the geopolitics of this, so I'm not going to say more about that. I'll just quote the experts who point out that Russia and China and other places are really invested in well-funded campaigns to push out anti-science nonsense for Western consumption. Okay. The reasons vary. Among them, they're trying to increase the profile of their vaccine, of the Sputnik vaccine and of the Chinese vaccine, in opposition to the mRNA vaccines. And they're also trying to just sow discontent and chaos in our society. So, among the things that the disinformation campaigns rely on is weaponized social media. This is an information war, and the battlefield is social media. And the funny thing is, the disinformation side, well-funded, well-organized, really quite impressive in what they've done. The other side, us, we have no money. We don't take direction from the government. We're not organized. It's really a bunch of individual citizens who decide to go on Twitter and respond to nonsense. And so we're going to lose. We're just overgunned. We're outgunned. They also use a lot of science by YouTube video. Well-produced, high-quality YouTube videos and a lot of memes. So here, more news articles. Russia behind the spread of coronavirus disinformation. U.S. State Department has explained the levers by which disinformation, COVID disinformation, has been spread. Among them, they will fund a handful of writers who push false narratives online. Yeah, they're actually individual writers, journalists, and most of us know who they are now. I'm not going to name them, who have received money from these foreign governments to push untruths online. Second, social media. Most often it was Facebook, now it's Twitter, with a lot of fake profiles. When you investigate, they're found to be linked to the Russian military, all these bots. Proxy websites, so like Newsfront and Southfront. These look like news sites, but they're not. They're just websites, and they're run from Russia, China, and Belarus. A lot of bots that amplify fringe positions. Interestingly, when Russia invaded Ukraine, a fascinating thing happened. All of these bots that were pushing COVID misinformation suddenly switched to pushing pro-Russia war information, which really underlines and strengthens the CSIS and State Department positions on this. Another funny thing happened was that Twitter briefly banned Russian and Belarusian accounts in the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and as a result, the COVID misinformation dropped precariously. It was noticeable. It was so quiet for many of us online. It's like, oh, no one's sending me death threats anymore. Why is that? Because they were coming from the same accounts that were promoting a certain kind of international propaganda. But it's not just Russians and Chinese and Belarusians and other kinds of foreign disinformation agencies. It was also corporate disinformation. So if you don't know who the Koch brothers are, they own a lot of extreme right-wing media in the USA. I won't name those agencies, but you can look them up. And the Koch brothers actually backed a lot of the anti-COVID, anti-vaccine, anti-mask organizations early on, and they tried to hide their involvement, but it was there. So they're well funded. And in fact, it was found that the anti-vax groups on Facebook, who were trying to push distrust of the COVID vaccines, were doing so well before we even had a COVID vaccine. Think about that. They know nothing about the vaccine. They know nothing about whether we even have a vaccine, but they're already trying to make people distrust it. Very suspicious. So how did I get to be involved in all this? That's not me, even though I do dress similarly. In early 2020, my students were emailing me saying, hey, there's this disease in China. Should I be worried about this? And I said, no, I don't know. I'm not paying attention. Why? Because my girlfriend / wife was pregnant. We're expecting our first child in a few weeks, and I had other things on my mind. And I went on paternity leave, and that's when the first numbers started coming down of infection in North America. It was late February or so. And so I stayed up late one night and I did my own modeling, my disease modeling, and I realized something quite horrific that you all know now, but back then it was shocking that no one was talking about except for a handful of epidemiologists in the disease modeling laboratories in England and in the USA. And that was that this isn't going to last a few weeks. It's not going to last a few months. It's going to last multiple years, maybe 4 or 5 years. And certainly right now we're into the 5th year now. And it dawned on me that my elderly parents who live in Toronto might never get to see my child who's about to be born. And this filled me with absolute dread because the mortality projections were quite dire. I thought my parents are going to die before they see their grandchild. And I was literally, my girlfriend found me the next morning lying in the fetal position. I had to explain to her what my revelation was. And it occurred to me too, well, my kid is going to ask one day, said, Dad, you're an epidemiologist. What did you do during the great pandemic of 2020? And I didn't know what my answer would be because I'm not an infectious disease epidemiologist. I'm just a generic global health epidemiologist. But I write well. And I decided my job is going to be to communicate. So I wrote a blog post. And that blog post was COVID-19, what's the end game? And this was, I don't know, March of 2020 or so. And my blog would get like, a couple hundred reads per week. This one got 500,000 impressions that week. And I realized, oh my goodness, nobody is talking about this, and people really want people to talk about this, especially those of us with credentials. It sounds ludicrous now, but I ask you to cast your minds back to March of 2020 about how hard it was to get any kind of expert opinion and commentary. It really was hard because nobody knew what to say. We're all living in the dark. But I figured I'll explain what I can. And as a result of this blog post, the media came knocking. And they came knocking hard. And as a result, I was thrust into the public stage to do endless commentary about very, very simple things. Right? I realize people aren't... One time I was asked to be on a TV show with Isaac Bogach, talking about the new disease modeling coming down. And I was all night studying up on disease modeling so I could sound smart and be useful. And the questions that the anchor gave us was just so simplistic. I realized nobody really wants high-level, doctoral-level expertise. They want low-level, high school level or undergrad level explainers. And that was a revelation. So around there, I made a prediction of how the public's reaction to we experts would emerge and evolve. This is March of 2020. I predicted, number one, there'd be denial. There's no emergency. This thing is no worse than the flu. We saw that. Number two, there'd be panic. People are dying. Where are the experts? Definitely saw that in March. Number three, gratitude. Thank you for helping us get through this. We saw this in April, May, as the numbers started to drop. Number four, we saw anger. When people started getting upset that they're being asked to do things they didn't want to do. Definitely saw that. We would see denial. When people say, what's the big deal? I didn't die. Nobody I knew died. And then lastly, resentment. There was never any pandemic to begin with. This is exactly what we have seen and continue to see in waves. And it saddens me that I was right about that. Another episode I want to talk about is these two guys. You may not remember these guys, but they came up in March of 2020 during the worst of the lockdowns. And there were a couple of doctors from California, and they put out this YouTube clip that got tens of millions of views, and they claimed that the pandemic was already over because they did math. They did math poorly. And so I wrote a blog post explaining what was wrong with their math. And oh my goodness, this exposed me to the American audience. And with the American attention came a lot of hate, including a lot of racism, death threats, the whole deal, because that's what comes from American attention, frankly. By the way, of course, they're wrong. It's ludicrous. Their calculations were just nonsensical, elementary stupidity. But the lesson there was It's one thing to be a little bit well known in Canada. Once you're well known to an American audience, it's a whole different ballgame. Let's talk a bit about why people were misunderstanding and couldn't appreciate the nature of the pandemic and the threat that it posed. Here's a quote from Albert Bartlett. The greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. I don't think that's the greatest shortcoming, but it is a shortcoming. And I will tell you, I've identified at least 4 cognitive problems people have in appreciating the data that we try to express. And this underlines the need for clearer and better strategized public health communication. Number 1, as Bartlett says, is people don't understand exponential growth. And I have lots of examples of this. The reason for this is we're not wired evolutionarily to understand exponential growth. If you were to throw a rock in the savannah as a hunter-gatherer 200,000 years ago, that's a parabolic trajectory, but it's still linear in its relationship incrementally. Well, not really, but it's not exponential, that's for sure. Exponential growth is not something we experience on a day-to-day level, requiring our brains to adapt to it. As a result, by the time you appreciate it and notice it, it's too late. A good example of this is artificial intelligence. Right? For a while now, experts have been saying artificial intelligence is growing in complexity at an exponential rate. And 10 years ago, we said, yeah, sure, that's fine. 5 years ago, yeah, sure, that's fine. Now it's exceeding us. And people are saying, oh, we didn't see this coming. Yeah, we saw it coming, but you didn't appreciate what exponential growth meant. Next is the inability to distinguish between individual risk and population risk. Here's an example of this. How many times during the pandemic did you hear somebody say, why should I be afraid of a disease with a 99% survival rate? Well, if you do the math, you should be terrified of a disease with a 99% survival rate. If you have a 1% chance of dying every time you cross the street, how many street crossings would it take to make you nervous? So it's a numbers game here. 99% survival sounds great for you one time, but applied to a population of millions, that's tens of thousands of people dead. That's exactly what we're seeing. And yeah, and by the way, the fatality rate is about 1% pre-vaccine, so that's not unreasonable. But that's the whole thing, right? And that speaks to a values thing as well. Focus on yourself, not on the population. We still see that today with all the messaging around the vaccines. Like, not everybody needs the vaccine, just those at high risk. No. The reason everybody gets the vaccine is to protect the population, not the individual. But that's another story. Next is the inability to accept uncertainty. If I tell people right now the current XBB booster has a 60% efficacy in preventing hospitalization, 60%. And the pushback is always, well, I got the vaccine and I ended up in the hospital. Yeah, you're one of the 40%. Right? So it's the inability to appreciate that nothing offers perfect protection. It's a hard concept for people to understand. Hey, these people got the vaccine and they ended up dying. Yeah, but most people didn't. Right? It's frustrating, the inability to appreciate the comparison of rates. Lastly, accepting rules in the abstract, but not at the individual level. An example of this is we all appreciate the need for speed laws on the highway. You don't want idiots going 200 miles an hour on the 401. That's ridiculous. But we all speed, right? We all push it a little bit because it doesn't really apply to me. It applies to the population as a whole in the abstract. But on the individual level, I'm going to push the boundaries a bit. You know, we appreciate the need for traffic lights. You know, when it's red, you stop. When it's green, you go. But we all look around, see if any cars are there, and run across the street when the light is red. And this applies to public health as well. Right? There's rules around not infecting other people. There were mask mandates at one point and vaccine mandates, and people thought this is oppressive. But you expect the population to have somewhat oppressive rules. You just don't like it applying to you. Anyway, we can talk more about that. So, some thoughts on public health communication. these interventions do not fall into a social vacuum. Everything is received and processed through social prisms. So what you hear me say, you will hear through who you are and who you're back. Right now, some of you are angry at me, I'm sure. You're thinking, oh, this is wrong, Professor. This is my experience, right? Because you're hearing it through a particular social prism. Next, there's going to be differences between what I say and what you hear. Audiences hear something differently from what you say. You got to say it multiple times in different ways to make sure you're not misunderstood. I am misquoted so often, resulting in so much hate mail. It's crazy. Or the most common thing is the titles of newspaper articles that I've written or am quoted in never represent what's actually said in the article. It's always the most inciting title to get people to click on it. And most people don't read the article. They just see the title and they send you a hate message. It's predictable. And last, every audience is different. So you got to, are you talking to media, policymakers, fellow scientists, or just general public? That's going to determine the level that you express yourself in and the takeaway message you want them to have. What is the purpose? When someone writes to me, what is the purpose of my response? Sometimes they're picking a fight with me. Am I going to pick a fight back? Sometimes I have, and I regret it. But I'm a human being. I make mistakes. Is it to win an argument? That is tempting, and many of us fall into this trap of trying to fix their way of thinking. I don't think it is to win an argument. Is it to dig in your heels and say, I'm right and you're wrong? Of course not. Is it to change their minds? Maybe. Maybe. I'm of the opinion these days that when I interact with the public now, my goal is not so much one of these things, though the last one is tempting. It's to create a better relationship, because that's the crisis at the moment. A poor relationship between the public and supposed experts. We got to fix that. So what is the role of the science communicator? Is it to combat misinformation? Some would say yes, and that's part of it, sure. Is it to interpret science? Absolutely. Is it to massage the message? Oh, I don't like that at all. And that is what a lot of people think we do, and what a lot of public health officials expect us to do. And by massaging the message, I mean, here is the message we want to get across, and I'm going to sell it to you in an appetizing, digestible format. Nope, don't like that at all. Is it to dumb down a concept? I don't look at it as dumbing down. I look at it as expressing a thing in ways in which you can understand it. And if I can't do that, it means I don't understand it myself. Is it self-promotion? A little bit. I'm a brand, I guess. Is it to promote the profession? Yeah. I recognize all the time that I'm representing epidemiologists, and I want the world to see what we do and what we don't do. But is it to push an agenda? I really hope not. But I said earlier that I'm trying to build relationships. That's an agenda. So yeah, all of this is a little bit true. I have this here as the denier playbook. I won't spend too much time on this. I don't think it's that important, actually. So what are the tools that we use in public health and science communication? The op-ed. Op-ed is an opinion editorial article we write for a newspaper. It's lost its shine in the last few years as blogs have taken off and as social media has taken off, and fewer people read them, but they are still critical. I write a lot of op-eds. And the reason I do so is if there's a particular thing, like why we need a mucosal vaccine, or why you shouldn't choose this you shouldn't go vaccine shopping, or why masks work, etc. I write it down, I present the evidence, it's in the public record now, and I can point to it. Other people can point to it. It creates an arsenal in the public discourse. So I think that's important. Podcasts are important. They're growing in impact, not nearly as impactful as you might think, and they're shareable. They're also long form, and they can, if you have a good personality and a good voice and speak well, it can be quite impactful. But it's not nearly as impactful as you might think. Tweet threads are great, especially if you have technical explanations. For example, if the other day, there's I'll say it, a foolish scientist named Brett Weinstein who's claiming that 17 million people have been killed by the COVID vaccine. It's nonsense. They've not been in the USA. And I point out why his argument is nonsense. And I did so in a tweet thread. So 7 tweets dissecting his analysis, which was just ludicrous. But that thread is then shared, and people point to it and use it as ammunition against those pushing this fake agenda. And I'm a fan of Facebook because Facebook, well, ever since they banned news sharing in Canada, it's been a real problem. But Facebook was good for controllable virality, by which I mean I control the content, I control who sees it, I can create a public Facebook post and then share it on other platforms. So there isn't a word limit, a length limit. So I find it quite useful. What I've learned that blog posts can be powerful. Oh my goodness, I thought blogs were dead. They're not dead. They are proxy news articles. It can be. Social media is a battlefield. An exhausting one. I think its time is probably limited. I don't know what we'll have in 5 years, but it's been crazy. Op-eds have diminished power, but they're useful. And we should always expect abuse. As a result, I have developed some philosophies for protecting myself, and I now teach those philosophies to epidemiology grad students and our grad students as well. I think it's an important opportunity to develop some kind of personal resilience. If you're going to be subject to random attacks by the general population, you got to learn to be strong about it, to be resilient. And that's been a learning process. I've learned that we have a public crisis in science education. We have a public crisis in trust. And nobody knows how to fix either of these things. I have some ideas, but they take a long time. And we are in big trouble for the next big public health crisis because of these two things. Social media. So here's the problem with social media. Well, a lot of problems. A YouTube clip reaches millions of people in minutes. And the anti-vaxxer, anti-science, COVID denier crowd are really good at producing these clips because they do so in secrecy and they drop it on you. It's highly slick, well-produced clips with the illusion of science behind it. You got a bunch of talking heads in lab coats looking very stern and serious on a well-mic'd platform saying nonsense. But what is our response as proper scientists? Our response is to write a peer-reviewed paper. Peer-reviewed paper takes months to get to press. And the average number of people who read them is 2. Now, this is a debatable number. Some people estimate 2, not including the author, but it's not a lot. Definitely not millions. Right? So we're losing that battle. Proper science loses against fake science every time because of that imbalance. Social media has been weaponized by the disinformation merchants. They figured this out long before we did. They capitalize on low science literacy. How many times do you hear people saying that I want all the mRNA out of my body? But you can't. mRNA is an intrinsic part of your body. It's nonsense. But they rely on people not understanding that to push that nonsense narrative. They exacerbate the existing political divisions. There's a reason that that COVID disinformation, vaccine disinformation falls along political lines. A certain political party will adopt them more than another one will. And I'm not criticizing that political party necessarily. I'm just saying they've decided that that is the party that's going to be profiting. So all these things are kind of aligned. And pandemics historically have a history of exacerbating existing cracks in society. The cracks we have now are ideological. They used to be socioeconomic, but they're largely ideological now. And that's the one that's being prized apart. Real science is at a disadvantage because real scientists are boring, right? Think about it. We are so boring. Whereas the fake scientists say the most inciting, fun things that get you all riled up. Real scientists respond with, well, maybe, and one study says this, and we have a strong suspicion that this, it's so boring and dry. Solutions. Well, what I've learned is I try not to fight anger with anger. I fail sometimes. I do get angry, and it's cost me. But I try when I can to smother it with compassion and reason. It doesn't always win. Like if I'm arguing with somebody online, I won't change their mind. But other people watching see that I'm the reasonable one. And that wins points in the long run. Data do not compel people. Stories do. So, Foucault, the founder of postmodernism, famously said, "The universe is not made of atoms. The universe is made of stories, narratives." 100% true. What he's saying there is that the world that we construct for ourselves is not based on some data set you analyze one day. It's based on what your best friends are like. It's based upon the people you surround yourself with, what they think, what they feel. So we as proper scientists, when we talk about this stuff, we have to stop relying so much on the numbers and more on the anecdotes and on the implications, sadly. We can't always be responding to misinformation. By the time misinformation is out there, the damage is done. We have to get ahead of the curve and flood the waves with proper information. Got to be proactive. Here's a sample of some of the fun emails I get, because I'm a racist fuck. I'm sent to Nuremberg because I'm a fascist. Why? Because I talk to people on Twitter. I'm a fascist. That's great. So why did I get involved? I believe there's a moral responsibility of professors and scientists to see that taxpayers, meaning you and your parents, get a return on your investment. You pay me to teach, to do research, all that fun stuff, but also in the time of public crisis, that if I have an expertise to offer, I have to offer it. That's what I do. Some things that are obvious to epidemiologists or whatever specialty you are not obvious to most people. And so there's, again, a moral imperative for you to speak up. People need us. People need you. You got to step up. So, conclusion. We have a crisis of trust. How do you build back trust? Well, I think you got to refuse conflict. And you always have to be the adult in the room. You got to be compassionate. You have to acknowledge people's fears and pains. And again, they might not respond to it, but the audience does. Got to listen more than we talk. That's hard. It's really hard. But we got to try. And we got to be transparent. Meaning what? I keep my identity public, so people know who I am. It's dangerous. My family does not like it. When I do, the media come to take pictures of me and stuff. It's not near my house. You don't get to see my kid. I gotta protect myself. But if I were anonymous, if I wasn't clear with who my funders are and etc., I would not build trust. So transparency is critical. Transparency as well in the limits of my knowledge. So I'm asked all the time by media, like, can you comment on the economic implications of this or on the psychology of that? I could. I have my opinions, but I shouldn't, because that's not my expertise. Got to be transparent with my limitations. A lot of people aren't. And you see a lot of the misinformation merchants are saying things that clearly they have no expertise in. And I think that hurts them in the long run. Okay, those are all my slides, and I want to hear from you. Now, how do I turn off this screen sharing? Let me see. Screen sharing. Stop screen sharing. Is it done? Okay. Is my screen still being shared? I can't tell. Okay, fantastic. So yeah, any questions, anybody? Oh, I see.
Thank you so much. You already have a question. Jad.
Hi, I love the presentation. This is a topic I'm really interested in. But during your presentation, I kept thinking back to, it's an internet influencer person that does like interviews in like really controversial settings, like flat earth conventions and the such. And he has that kind of approach where he will let people talk themselves into a hole. Like he stands there, lets them talk. And it's really interesting, like from a viewer perspective, because me, who doesn't hold the flat earther perspective, but a flat earther will both look at that and accept that being presented to us, because it's not like clipped out or anything. It's like exactly what they say. And it's that same thing of, if you let them speak and you just listen and you give your factual information, at the end of the day, when you're watching it, you see who is like based properly in their opinions, if that makes sense. Like you'll see the logic through that. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I tend to agree, but not fully. So it does come down to the charisma of the speakers. So recently, Joe Rogan had invited Peter Hotez to debate RFK Jr. This created a big media scandal. So full disclosure, many years ago, Joe Rogan had invited me on to debate Peter Duesberg. Peter Duesberg was an HIV denier. He does not believe that HIV causes AIDS, and he's wrong. It's caused a lot of pain as a result. I said no to that invitation for a number of reasons, including A, I wasn't confident that I was a good enough debater, and B, I was nervous that if I wasn't a good enough debater, all I'm doing is giving Peter Duesberg more airtime. Same with the Peter Hotez situation. Hotez debating RFK. Now, one could argue that if they're both on stage at the same time, given the 3 hours that Rogan offers, that the truth will prevail. The problem is that if you have a highly articulate, charismatic speaker who is more than happy to lie, like RFK Jr. is, that will win over a huge amount of audience. Peter Hotez is not physically attractive. He's a fine speaker, not nearly as charismatic, will cite data that will drive away a lot of the audience, and he will lose. And he knows that. There is one of my favorite Plato books is Gorgias, or Georgius, however you want to pronounce it. And the book is about a debate between Gorgias and Socrates. Socrates, the master of reason, Gorgias, the master of rhetoric, and Socrates wins. In real life, he wouldn't win, though. And this is explored in the book, where they talk about how it's when the audience is not an expert at what the thing you're talking about, it's easy to lie to them, and charisma will always win. So in the example you put out, the flat earthers don't have a lot of charisma amongst the ranks, because there's not a lot of money to be made from pushing the flat earth agenda. The anti-vax movement, enormous amounts of money, because it comes with it the selling of natural health products and all kinds of stuff that doesn't work. And so they attract highly charismatic, good speakers who debate well. I'm not saying that what you point out does not have merit. It just scares me, because an RFK Jr. could wipe the floor with someone like me, as articulate as I think I am. If you're willing to lie and cite studies that don't exist, or miscite them, which is most commonly, who's going to check up on you? Yeah. So that's how I feel about it. I haven't got the right answer here. It's just that it's just frustrating when people do not respond to data and argument. They respond to personality.
Yeah, just to continue on that, unless someone has another question, but that interviewer, well, that journalist person also spoke to Joe Rogan, which is interesting that you mentioned him. But he ended up following a lot of the people that were involved in January 6th insurrection, but he did it accidentally, and it kind of like he was on the backside of it and kind of was able to follow where the money was, which was really interesting. How a lot of these situations kind of come down to money at the end of it, because it's like whoever has the most money or wherever there's money to make is where like people with maybe questionable morals end up going.
100%.
So
I mean, the whole argument is follow the money that leads you to the truth. And that's true, but that's used by the quote-unquote other side also, where, I mean, I've been paid by AstraZeneca to advise them on talking about their vaccine. I gave away all the money to charity. It was like $2,000, it was a lot of money. But the fact that I've been paid by a drug company is used against me all the time, right? So follow the money goes both ways, and it's frustrating. My colleagues all the time are accused of, you're a pharma shill, you're paid by drug companies. No, not. So, or if you got a government grant, as we all do, suddenly you're a government shill. Follow the money is real. When it comes to communication, follow the money can be a double-edged sword. Any other questions, comments? Anybody? Jokes? Everybody watching TV?
Jeremy?
Yeah, I have a quick question, Dr. Deonandan.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Just wondering, in terms of like misinformation and stuff, common controversial topic comes up is like the role of censorship. And like, I guess I was curious about your thoughts on that, and whether governments should think about, regulating social media and censoring, because it's obviously a controversial topic.
I think politically, I would say no to any kind of censorship. The main reason is that people are so sensitive to it that the reflex would be, see there, what don't they want us to know, and then suddenly alternative information channels get opened up. And what does censorship even mean? I mean, censorship technically is that the government is under no obligation to give you a platform. That's all it means. So, but it doesn't prevent you from seeking a platform on a private server. Twitter is private. They're free to have people on say whatever they want or whatever they don't want. That's not censorship. That's that's private management of the platform. And you can argue ethically whether that's true or not, whether maybe because it is the de facto public square, it should be subject to government oversight. But I'm among those free. How do I put this? Hate speech is real, but when it overlaps into criminal content, then the police get involved. If it's not criminal, then people can say what they want to say, right? And if I prevent them from saying in a certain venue, they're going to say it elsewhere. So I think this kind of speech, this kind of misinformation, the kind of falsehoods, must be combated in public. And if they're in private, they can't be combated. I did a study. I went undercover like 30 years ago for the Toronto Star. I said I wasn't going to say the paper. I said the paper's name. Into neo-Nazi discussion forums back in the 90s when the internet was new. And it was scary and terrifying and interesting. So back then, you had to use dial-up internet connections and enter Usenet groups and so forth. But the neo-Nazi skinhead groups were organizing. And so I went in as a freelance journalist, pretending to be a neo-Nazi skinhead online. And it was interesting. And I wonder, it was kind of hard to combat that kind of verbiage when they outnumber you so much. And you got to be careful about protecting your identity and things like that. You got to be subtle about it. On the other hand, if it was out in the open, the amount of support I would have had would have been extraordinary. And I think the additional amount of shame they would have experienced might have been useful. Now, the landscape has changed somewhat. I'm not sure if that's entirely true anymore, where I think now some neo-Nazi sensibilities might actually find more support than we have in the past, sadly. But I still think there's an old saying, bad ideas are best sterilized in sunlight. So I worry about pushing things into the darkness where we cannot see it and acknowledge it. Rambling answer, sorry. Other questions, comments?
I do have a very practical question. You're an epidemiologist, so how can you explain that in Canada the pandemic resulted in actually much less death than in other countries? So there's the states, of course, and the complex the complexity of their reactions in the States, but also in Europe, where people are, they were much less reacting against the government measures and etc.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
Some things come to mind. One is the first thought would be, first of all, measuring the differences. Is it infection rate, death rate, hospitalization rate? If it's death and hospitalization, I would first suggest the demographics are different. Like maybe the age distribution are different, but they're not. Age distribution in Canada is kind of similar to Western Europe. Second would be healthcare systems infrastructure, but we have a worse infrastructure than Western Europe. That doesn't explain it. Third would be population dynamics, like density. We have a less dense population, but where we do have cities, they're quite dense. They're comparable to, like Toronto's comparable to London and Paris and places like that. So all these things don't hold water. I think it comes down to policy, government policy, and importation of infection. So in Europe, they're importing infection at a higher rate. More borders, fewer border closures, and they're seeing infection earlier. We had the opportunity of seeing what was happening in Europe and responding. And it depends on what portion of the pandemic we're talking about as well. Different time periods have different kind of responses. But in general, we saw the quote-unquote British variant pop up sometime in 2020. We took some measures to slow its importation and so forth. Also, I think our provincial responses were more rational than many of the national responses in Europe. we had better border management. We had closed borders, for one thing. We had mask mandates, that actually were better adhered to than many parts of Europe. Our vaccine mandate was better adhered to as well, vaccine passports, when that was useful. It's not anymore, but it was useful for a brief period in 2021. And school closures. It's a touchy subject, but it's pretty clear now, for those of us who follow the data, that school closures really had an impact on the spread of the disease. Schools are a pandemic accelerator. This is a hot button political topic, but England refused to have school mitigation at all, and they paid the price, absolutely. And more data is showing this. In the American case, it's pretty clear what the difference is. It's political. The refusal to adopt any kind of mitigation strategy. The adoption by many of the governors of absolute COVID minimization language and philosophy. The anti-vax sentiment. It's crazy down there. But yeah, good question. No one knows for sure, but those are my theories. We have a book coming out actually this year on the legal, ethical, and epidemiological aspects of border closures during COVID. And we cover some of that. So that's coming out this spring.
Thanks. Another question, comment.
Like my fake background, anybody? Yeah.
I may have another one. So you insist on the fact that misinformation is very, very easy to spread on YouTube, for example, or things like that. And you made a compelling argument that peer-reviewed papers are read by a mean of 2 people, while YouTube is seen by millions of them. Don't you think that government or maybe just university have the obligation to, when a paper is published with a very little audience, to try to do things like YouTube or whatever, as a proactive measure to counteract the misinformation that is spread on social media or whatever?
Yes, that would help. The way that governments and universities make YouTube videos, though, is very dry, and they haven't gotten you the following that they need. There are some heroic independent YouTube influencers. Debunk the Funk comes to mind. Susan Oliver, a UK scientist, comes to mind. Excellent YouTube channels who do this kind of thing in an entertaining fashion at enormous personal cost. Right? So I think the role for universities and government would be to identify influencers like that and assist them in financing their platforms if they're willing to do the work. There's enough motivated, passionate, brave people out there willing to do the work if they get the financial and resource support. Whereas if we were to build that infrastructure from ground up, we would do a poor job at it. And also, not every paper that we produce is worthy of this sort of thing.
Yeah,
right?
of course.
So what's really needed isn't the amplification of new research. It's the careful dissection of poor research. Because there's so much bad research being amplified by these disingenuous YouTube channels that needs to be taken down. There's so many examples of this, so many. There's several anti-mask studies that are just so poorly done, and they're landed upon by certain political actors to push an agenda. And it's clear when you look at who the authors are, what the purpose of the paper was. There's like a systematic. Okay, I'm trying hard not to name names here. Okay, there are disenfranchised, dishonored, fired former professors of this university producing absolute nonsense research published on their blogs. And if you took the time to read it, as I have, against the migraine, their source material says the exact opposite of what they're concluding. But no one takes the time to point that out. Right? Instead, the conclusions are run with without any sort of introspection. The governor of Florida is running with the conclusion based upon a blog post by a fired professor who says nonsense, right? So all it takes is someone to create a platform where someone like me, I guess I would do it, or like Debunk the Funk would go on and point out why this is nonsense. It doesn't take a lot; it just takes the creation of a platform. Jade, another question?
No, just well, yes and no, more comment. But I feel like a lot of these issues also stem from like science literacy lacking in the general population. And with social media growing so fast, even just media literacy, like taking that time to go back and look at who wrote the article or wrote the blog post, to look at their credentials and consider whether or not their opinion is biased, or where like their point of view, the perspective that that information is coming from, is something like, especially during the pandemic, a high stress period, that people are not taking the time to do that, or maybe lack the capacity because the change has been so fast.
You're absolutely right, and it's a dangerous thought, though, and here's why. Right now, the fastest growing high school class in the U.S. is, believe it or not, media literacy. It's hugely popular, which sounds good, right? The problem is how it's taught. Unless the teacher really understands what they're doing, unless the source material that they're using to teach is excellent, it's going to end up being trust no one. So media literacy does not mean trust no one. Media literacy means conduct a proper critical appraisal. The problem with trust no one is they won't trust us either. Hell, that talking head on this, they're paid by the government. They're obviously evil. And I'm fond of pointing out that when we're doing a critical appraisal, who the author was matters, but it's probably the least important thing. It's possible that someone who is funded by the forces of evil can still produce good work. So, but have you got the intellectual capacity and the skill set to dissect that work and to figure out whether it's good or bad? That's the hard thing. You're 100% correct, though, that the problem here is science and media literacy. And I've long held that the way to inoculate a population against bad ideas is proper education. This, unfortunately, cannot be done in a matter of weeks. It will take years, if not decades. The entire generation, my generation's got to die out before this is fixed. And I've been trying to figure out how to approach government about the plan of how to fix science literacy. I'm not the only one. Other people are doing the same thing. But yeah, that's what we're facing right now. And I think what we have to be, something that our school is actually pretty good at, is teaching critical appraisal skills. And we've got to really invest more in that and push it out more so. I will say, when I do talk about this stuff with undergrad students, it is shocking the fraction of them who, despite having received critical appraisal education, still cannot appraise critically. And so even though we do a fairly good job at this, the rate of failure in getting that message across is still too high. So it's something we got to work on. But you're right, this is a literacy issue.
Thanks. Another question, comment?
Oh.
Okay.
All right. Well, hey, I had a good time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was really a brilliant presentation. Thanks, Ray.
Oh, my pleasure.
And yeah, and I think so happy New Year to everybody, and I will see you in 2 weeks, I guess.